Welcome, Professor William Mazzarella. And thank you very much that you take time to speak to us today. My name is Andreas Nehrig. I'm one of the directors of this research institute here, and it's my pleasure to introduce you briefly. Professor Mazzarella is professor in anthropology and social science at the University of Chicago at the Divinity School. And he works in a transdisciplinary intersection of, on one hand, social anthropology, but then also critical theory, media studies, and also theology, psychoanalysis, and what has interested me most and how I knew him, also South Asian studies. And finally, of course, and that's why we have invited him, esotericism. And he writes and teaches on political anthropology, on mass publicity, on critical theory and aesthetics of religion, ritual and performance studies, and so on. And he has published various books, also studies on the importance of advertising and consumer citizenship in colonial India. And my colleague Dominic Müller has used his research already for his own research on advertising in Malaysia. I've come to know Professor Mazzarella by reading his book Between Sedition and Seduction. It's a book about censorship in South Asia, which he published in 2009. But he has also published various other books. And I would like to mention that already in 2016, he has published on Donald Trump and populism in the US. But today we are here to advertising as integral magic and afterlife. Professor Mazzarella, welcome, and we are looking forward to listen to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Because I can't see the room, so I actually don't know who I'm speaking to at this moment. So is it possible to turn the camera around so that I can see the room?
Yes, I will do it.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Well, I'm just going to get started. And thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me. I'm really excited about the project that you're doing. Happy to offer this work in progress as a kind of opening for a conversation. So we're used to thinking of advertising as a manipulative kind of magic, but we don't think as much about what that magic demands of its magicians. Why should advertising folk be immune to the powers that they summon? Or to put it a bit more strongly, why should they be safe from the powers that they summon? The books that advertising people write, while often entertaining, aren't much help in this respect. Marshall McLuhan once said, "Ads are news. The trouble with them is that they are always good news." It's the same with advertising memoirs. They tend to be puckish, self-promotional larks in which the protagonist bounces cheerfully from one improbable marketing yarn to the next, dazzling the world, not to mention themselves, with their mysterious ability to zig where others zag. For all its carefully cultivated light-footedness, this is a heavily armored genre. It is in fact itself a genre of advertising. One is given to understand that it would be terribly bad form, terribly humorless to take any of it too seriously. And yet, the foolish anthropologist, as ever, can't help wading in where angels, not to mention much less subtle-bodied beings, fear to tread. The idea that advertising is a kind of magic isn't new. Just in my own discipline, anthropology, it's been a recurrent theme since Bronislaw Malinowski made a few half-joking comments in the mid-1930s about parallels between Trobriand garden magic and European perfume ads. But the problem, again, is that the whole thing tends to end up feeling a bit whimsical, a bit charming. And of course, advertising people are happy to keep it at that level. Yeah, sure, we do a kind of magic, as long as it all stays sparkly and cheeky. I'm afraid I'm going to insist on digging a bit deeper here, because I think that precisely by taking this question of advertising as magic seriously, we can open up some quite fundamental problems in new ways. First of all, the idea of advertising as magic troubles the disenchantment story that is still so often taken for granted as a description of industrial modernity. Thinking advertising as magic allows us to see how magic appears in modernity not as a survival, not as a regression or as a compensation against or despite radicalization.
May I interrupt?
I'm sorry?
May I
Yeah.
interrupt? Second, we cannot see your PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's intentional. It's a blank screen right now.
Oh,
Okay.
perfect.
All right.
Sorry.
I didn't want to distract you with anything right now. Thinking advertising as magic allows us to see how magic appears in modernity, not as a survival, not as a regression or as a compensation against or despite rational or disenchantment, built into the forms of publicity that feed our most supposedly secular institutions, mass democracy, consumer capitalism, and so on. And at the core of the question of publicity lies the question of how to activate the imagination through powers of influence, provocation, and resonance. Influence, a flowing in; provocation, a calling forth; resonance, a sounding again. What I'm presenting to you here today are a few parts of a much larger project, a book that I'm calling Magnetizer, A Fable of Spirit. The book is partly a historical ethnography of Bombay advertising from the 1950s to the 1980s. And in that sense, it complements my own earlier work that dealt with the Indian ad scene of the 80s and 90s. But Magnetizer is certainly not your standard academic monograph. Partly it's something like a non-fiction novel about a remarkable person, a man who was, all at once, a flamboyant advertising star, a poet, and an occultist. Partly it's a meditation on the relation between these intertwined magics, the magic of advertising, the magic of poetry, and the magic of, well, magic. At that level, it's an extension of stuff I was thinking about in my book a few years ago, The Mana of Mass Society. And it's this magic part that I want to focus on today. My aim is not so much to turn our attention to practices that are forgotten, rejected, or excluded by mainstream modernity, although I think that's a very interesting and important thing to be doing. My aim is rather to suggest that mainstream modernity is already magical, but that part of the problem is that most of the time, most people don't recognize that and don't know how to talk about it. That's why I tend to be attracted to topics like advertising, crowd action, and that uncanny ambiguous effect called charisma, because these are the places where enchantment is palpably present, precisely in places that are nevertheless generally understood to be somehow disenchanted. What this also means is that many of the things that we might call magic aren't recognized as such by the very people who are manifesting the magic. In that regard, I quite like something that the historian of religion, Ioan Culianu, once wrote, and I quote, "For a subject to take part in magic practices, it is not necessary that the idea of magic itself cross the threshold of his consciousness." It's Culianu, too, who suggests that both magic and mass publicity are arts of eros. For him, that means that they work on the imagination. In his classic text, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, Culianu writes, "Magic is a means of control over the individual and the masses, based on deep knowledge of personal and collective erotic impulses. Insofar as science and the manipulation of phantasms are concerned, magic is primarily directed at the human imagination, in which it attempts to create lasting impression. The magician of the Renaissance is both psychoanalyst and prophet, as well as the precursor of modern professions, such as director of public relations, propagandist, spy, politician, censor, director of communications media, and publicity agent." Now, Culianu's study is about Renaissance Neoplatonists like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno. They assumed that each one of us carries a unique matrix of addressability, and that a magician is able to awaken that addressability by choosing exactly the right phantasm for the job. A phantasm here means an image, a gesture, an idea, through which what is virtual in me, what is unconsciously dormant in me, comes alive on the stage of my imagination. So when a phantasm activates me, I don't experience myself as actively choosing. Rather, I experience myself as being overcome by an uncanny sense of encountering the very things I always wanted, except I didn't know I wanted it until that moment. This is what makes it possible to feel that miraculously we encounter exactly the right things and the right people at exactly the right time. The story I want to explore here today starts with an encounter with exactly the right person at the right time, except that at that time, I couldn't see it. The encounter took place on the 15th of May, 1998. On that day in Bombay, close to the end of my PhD fieldwork, I met a man called Kersy Katrak. To say that his legend preceded him would be an understatement. I'd heard stories of his flamboyance, of his theatricality, of his irrepressible spending, of the Olympian way he and his agency MCM bestrode the Bombay advertising scene in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The first thing people mentioned about MCM's ads was their sheer impact, like they came out of nowhere and hit you right between the eyes. Katrak himself was described, often in the same breath, as a creative genius, as a conman, as a shaman, and as a crook. As someone once said, a pirate with the heart and halo of a priest. It all amounted to a morality tale, having founded MCM, the agency, in 1965, and having presided over its rise to somewhere near the very top of the Indian advertising world in just 5 or 6 years, Katrak saw his fortune and his reputation collapse in 1975. Amid the unconcealed schadenfreude of all those industry rivals who had resented the swaggering arrogance of his prime, Katrak became a hunted man, pursued by creditors, abandoned by friends. Some said Katrak had shaved off his famously lustrous beard to pass unrecognized on the streets of Bombay. Others claimed that he showed up at his bankruptcy hearings in a Mercedes. There were stories of how he'd had to seek shelter from the wreckage of his life in Bombay in an ashram in the foothills of the Himalaya. The myth model was clear. Katrak was the magician undone by his own magic. This was pretty much all I knew at the time of our meeting in May 1998. I didn't know then, for example, that Katrak had published several volumes of poetry and that his flowering as a poet coincided with the flourishing of his ad agency. Nor was I aware of the depth of his involvement in the occult, or of the profound ways in which an attachment to esoteric magic pervaded both his poetry and, less obviously, his advertising practice. All I had back then was a simple, melodramatic narrative outline, swashbuckling rise and sickening fall, pride, prejudice, and punishment. In fact, Katrak's story seemed so completely to belong to the past, or perhaps even to the realm of myth, that I was astonished to find out during those last few weeks in the field, not only that he was still alive and living in Bombay, but also that he was still working in advertising. Clearly, I was going to have to try to meet him. After some carefully placed phone calls, I arrived at an office off to one side from what was then the Lintas advertising agency on the 15th floor of Express Towers in Nariman Point, the sea-facing business district near the southern end of the city. The man himself was not at all what I had expected. Here was a well-groomed and rather formal Parsi gentleman in his early 60s, short and a bit portly, sporting a three-piece suit and a clipped upper-class British-style accent, the famous beard still there, but now closely cropped and streaked with grey. All the same, Katrak did exude a slightly volatile charm, as if residues of his old hurtling self-confidence were overlaid and just about held in by what I even then recognized as the tremor of trauma. I had come to our meeting absorbed in the currency of my topic, advertising, and by extension of Katrak's place in it as a leading light of the Indian creative revolution of the 1960s. But it quickly became clear that Katrak could not have cared less about all that. For about 15 or 20 minutes, he answered my questions more or less mechanically. Then, perhaps sensing my disappointment, he seemed to decide that there was no point in dragging out the charade. Fixing me with a gaze at once weary and defiant, Katrak said, "When I was in MCM, advertising was my life. Since MCM broke down and I spent 4 years in the hills, advertising is the way I make money. It's my profession, it's not my life." Waving aside my half-formed response, Katrak, having taken the plunge, waded deeper. "In fact, I'm bored by advertising now." He explained that the only reason he was still doing it was because he had spent 12 years paying off his MCM debts and now just needed to make enough to retire. It's a way of earning my bread and my butter and my jam, but it's nothing else, and I'm good at it because I've been at it long enough. That's all. Thrown off track, I tried to rally, and we did manage to speak for another few minutes. But I felt the interview had failed. I took my leave of Katrak with a heavy sense of sadness, as if the center of something had collapsed, and wandered out into the early evening melee of honking taxis, exhaust fumes, commuters, and street food vendors. Katrak passed away at the end of 2007. We never met again. Some of the factual material from the early part of our interview made its way into my dissertation and my first book in the generic guise of historical background. Having overcome my disappointment with the present-day Katrak's ennui, I marshaled what stories I could from his golden era. But they remained in the picaresque, nostalgic register with which Bombay ad folk of a certain generation often like to remember their moment. I spoke a moment ago about the feeling of the phantasm that gives us the impression of encountering exactly the right thing at the right time. The thing that we always wanted, except we didn't know we wanted it until that very moment. For the longest time, it felt like I had encountered Kersy Katrak at the wrong time, a time too late, a time when he was no longer interested in talking about the things that then enchanted me. It wasn't until much later that I realized that a different phantasm lodged itself in me on that day. A phantasm something like the enigmatic image described by the great Australian writer Gerald Murnane. Whatever sort of image the author has in mind, he feels a certain feeling seeming to emanate from the image. The feeling is persistent, intense, and sometimes troubling, and yet at the same time promising. When the author first becomes aware of this feeling, he might seem to receive the same sort of wordless message that sometimes reaches him from some or another image person or image object in some or another dream. He seems to receive wordlessly the message, write about me in order to discover my secret and to learn what a throng of images, as yet invisible, lie around me. I sat with that wordless message for more than a decade. All that time, it obtruded and insisted, but I didn't quite know what to do with it. Then in 2009, I decided to return to the story of Katrak, of MCM, and of its moment in Indian public culture. Certainly the fact that Katrak was now gone made it possible for me to go back to the scene of our encounter in a different way. During the next couple of years, I spoke with dozens of his former colleagues and associates, with his widow and his daughter, with his friends and with his foes. Sooner or later during those interviews, I would wheel out my description of our meeting back in the spring of 1998, trying to evoke something in my interlocutors by evoking my own experience. Some of the people I interviewed hadn't known Katrak well enough to make much of my account of our meeting. Some of them dismissed his demeanor on that day as yet another piece of acting. But many others listened attentively, and many were moved, recognizing in the scene of the deflated magician something of their own long since deflated hopes. Some of these people were still angry with Katrak, more than 35 years after MCM had collapsed. They were angry about the way he had squandered and wasted their money, yes, but more importantly, they were angry about the way he had squandered and wasted their enthusiasm for an ad agency that to them represented everything that was expansive and exciting in Bombay between the Second War with Pakistan and Indira Gandhi's emergency. Over the years, when I've tried to clarify what exactly went wrong for Katrak, why exactly MCM crashed so badly in 1975, I've been told things like, I think Kersy was just an innocent artist. He was not a businessman. He had no other fault. Or, now he's dead and gone and I was very fond of him, but a lot of people believe that Kersy pulled out a lot of money. Or, unfortunately, he was a creative man. He didn't know how to handle the money. Or, Kersy Katrak with no business sense? I don't agree. Kersy Katrak as a spender? I agree. Or, in terms of creative work, Kersy had its sixth sense, but in terms of business, I think his sense was abysmal, absolutely abysmal, apart from the fact that he himself had no self-control about expenses. Or, the entire success of MCM, it was like a bubble. It got so big so fast. And here was a case where clients were lining up to work with Kersy instead of the other way around. Or, Kersy destroyed it with his own hands. Greed is a terrible thing. If he had just been a little less greedy, MCM would have been the largest agency in the country today, and he would have had more money than he'd have known what to do with. Or it was a case of a man becoming a megalomaniac and ruining his own business. It was one of the saddest stories of the time. Or finally, Kersy wasn't a business person at all. He was a great inspirer of human beings. Very often, as you can already tell from these fragments, people reached for an explanation that had something to do with Katrak not being able to balance creativity with sound business sense, which is to say, failing at the balancing act that is the holy grail of the ideology of advertising. The ideology that has to try to reconcile creativity, something that goes beyond economy, with economy, and pretending that there is no surplus, no leftover in that handy equation. But I think we already have a sense, too, that something more existential is at work here. What, for example, are we really talking about when we say that someone was a great inspirer of human beings? Perhaps we can add this term to our list: influence, the flowing in, provocation, the calling forth, resonance, the sounding again, and inspiration, the breathing in. In the early 1970s, Kersy Katrak and MCM seemed to all outward appearances to be riding high. In one of his most exuberant poems of the period, Katrak wrote as if all the energies were coming together, endlessly, limitlessly. The gates of strength swing wide, all trees of life burn in your hand, all things are possible. The highest perches are the most magnificent, but also buffeted by the strongest winds. Katrak's friend, the physician, painter, and poet Giv Patel, smiled his quiet smile, paused, and remarked, "I remember at the height of MCM, he had a flat at Bakhtava, which is a grand building facing the ocean. And he used to say, 'This apartment is Olympian.' He used that word." "Olympian?" I repeat. "Yes," affirms Patel. "That was the word." Patel is silent for a beat. And then, you see, he had to move out of Olympus. There are many scripts for gods or angels who fall to earth. Some will say, with the novelist John Crowley, that all angels are fallen angels. That's what makes them angels. But according to another of Katrak's friends, whom I will call Kunal, this most flamboyant of fallen angels knew full well that his descent was a punishment. Whereas Patel had known Katrak in pre-Olympian days, Kunal only met him after. "I met a latter-day Kersy," he explained, "and Kersy once told me that, 'Kunal, you know, I used to stay on top of this building, and I thought I was God. It's like the Greek gods, you know? I deserved this.'" "You mean the fall?" I asked. "The fall. This was hubris. Kersy knew all this. How human beings question God and how that is hubris. And therefore, I deserved this." A great inspirer of human beings. Thinking about Kersy Katrak during these last many years has given me an alibi to probe the mystical and occult materials that inspired him: Gurdjieff, Tantra, Kabbalah, Tarot, Theosophy, dream interpretation, and more. Especially Gurdjieff, Mr. G, the Greek-Armenian trickster mystic with whom Katrak strongly identified, redecorating his own home in the Gurdjieffian study house style, with Persian rugs on walls and floors, even claiming that they shared a birthday. They didn't, not quite. Gurdjieff, whom Katrak sometimes invoked as a kind of patron saint, last of the bodhisattvas and head of this unworthy household, he once called him, and later, more prosaically, Inspector General in these parts. Gurdjieff, who in the words of one of his biographers appeared, quote, "trustworthy because he appeared fraudulent. After all, it was the métier of fraudulent people to look trustworthy." Gurdjieff, with all his many personae, teacher of dance, traveler, philosopher, cook, carpet dealer, explorer, hypnotist, entrepreneur, and magician, how could Katrak, walking the tightrope of the mystic mass publicist, not identify? If Gurdjieff was Katrak's trickster spirit, then Sri Madhava Ashish was his living guru. Ashish presided over a small ashram in the Himalayan foothills near Almora in what is now the Indian state of Uttarakhand, but was born in Edinburgh as Alexander Phipps. He came to India during World War II as an aviation engineer and then stayed on to pursue a path that combined Blavatskyan theosophy with environmentalism and Hindu devotionalism in a Vaishnava Vairagi mode. Ashish once offered a definition of practical magic that's interesting to consider in the light of advertising. Magic, Ashish writes, deals in what he calls the powers of the middle region. The middle region is that exceedingly subtle place where the affordances that the world presents to us meet our capacity to detect and actualize them. And yet these are not mere passive potentialities. They have their own kind of life. Ashish says that these powers of the middle region are intelligent and semi-conscious and can sometimes be controlled by human will. Knowing how to control these powers is, Ashish suggests, the basis of practical magic. It's a matter of man's will acting on the inner or subtle aspect of form. The powers of the middle region are potentialities that aren't immediately evident or visible to the ordinary senses, but that can be activated if one knows how to touch an inner or subtle dimension of the given world. To some extent, we all have the ability. We know it in the power of seeing pictures in the random patterns of a rough wall surface, in the grain of wood, the ripples on water, the coals of a fire, the silhouette of a mountain range. The images, Ashish continues, spring out from a matrix of possibilities with a greater or lesser degree of objective support. It's always a delicate dance between what we are given and what we can make of it. What images lack in objectivity, we supply by psychic projection. Now, this is not just making things up, wish fulfillment, or seeing something that isn't there. Nor is it simply a matter of human will going to work on something that presents itself to us already given, already complete, needing only our instrumental ingenuity to put it to good use. Rather, in the middle region, we encounter living powers with their own kind of awareness. One might always ask whether there is any meaningful distinction between the powers of the middle region activating something in us and us activating something in them. Consider again Gerald Murnane's phrase about a throng of images as yet invisible, that the act of writing, which after all is also a modality of magic, may bring into focus. Trying to act in that subtle middle region is like trying to navigate a dream. As a state of consciousness, Ashish says, that region is akin to the state of dream with its characteristic blend of subjective and objective elements of experience. Some people are capable, according to Ashish, of accessing this zone in waking life, of tuning in to, and perhaps to some extent, directing the auratic capacities that hover in and around every seemingly ordinary object and situation. The subtle surround or aura of any physical body is spatially larger than the physical form that it permeates. It extends 10 fingers' breadth beyond, as the Upanishad says, of the inner ruler, and as some gifted people are able to see with the naked eye under suitable conditions. Ashish was, in many ways, and increasingly, the stern keeper of Katrak's conscience, often precisely by way of a practice of dream interpretation. So it's notable, I think, that his definition of practical magic steers clear of moral direction. By contrast, when that great, apparently amoral master of misdirection, Gurdjieff, was asked to distinguish black magic from white, he responds with a much more clear-cut caution. There is neither red, green, nor yellow magic, he insists. There is only a distinction between what happens and real doing. What happens is mechanical and includes everything that in ordinary life we misrecognize as active agents. The kind of magic in that it is the kind of doing that is only possible after long and hard work to separate from one's mechanical identifications and habits. There cannot, Gurdjieff insists, be two kinds of real doing, but there can be the false appearance of doing, a manipulative deception that plays on people's readiness to believe, their susceptibility to seduction. This is why, Gurdjieff says, real spiritual work can't be based on seduction or infatuation. It's not that black magic has anything to do with evil as such, Gurdjieff argues. Rather, what you call black magic is based on infatuation and on playing upon human weaknesses. Ashish remarked in a letter to his American follower, Cy Ginsberg, that the path of the black magician amounted to taking the power to oneself and using it as one's own, when in fact all effective power is divine eros. in the sense of a force far exceeding the intentions and capacities of an individual. Every caution, Ashish suggests, about making sure that one is bringing the power in from above is meant as a safeguard against this taking the power to oneself and using it as one's own. What happens if we compare this with the vision of magic that Giordano Bruno promoted? The magic that, to return to that passage from Culiano I quoted earlier, is a means of control over the individual and the masses based on deep knowledge of personal and collective erotic impulses. Where does that leave the magic of advertising? Where is the line between activating what Ashish called the powers of the middle region that live in the inner or subtle aspect of form, and the fraudulent action, the so-called black magic that is, as Gurdjieff puts it, based on infatuation and on playing upon human weaknesses? Is there a line between them? Ashish, for one, knew that the bills for magical action would eventually and inevitably have to be paid. He says, needless to say, 2 and 2 always do add up to 4 in the long run, the apparent discrepancy being paid for with interest, for such powers exact their price. We might say that the magician's currency is charisma. His work hovers amorally between world-making and manipulation, between opening a space for those powers of the middle region and playing upon human weaknesses. It wasn't until I made my own way up to the ashram at Mirtola 23 years after Ashish passed and 22 years after my meeting with Katrak that I heard the story of one of Katrak's first conversations with the Guru. Ashish would often ask a new visitor, "What are you?" The visitor would typically respond with a conventional, exoteric professional title, lawyer, doctor, engineer, or some such. But Katrak unhesitatingly responded, "I am a magician." And he was. Katrak started as an actor in his teens and very much brought that stage training to his advertising persona. Inside the agency he founded, MCM, the pressure to perform was intense, and no one played their part harder than Kersy Katrak. To the susceptible, Katrak's personal appeal was strong and undeniable. In conversation with one man who came to Bombay around 1970 as a young man to find a job in advertising, I only had to hint at Katrak's charismatic reputation for my interlocutor to launch into an extended appreciation. Oh yes, he was profoundly charismatic. He was. There were various components to that charisma. One is he was a very good-looking guy. He had this really thick black beard and these flashing dark eyes, and he had this very dramatic, deep voice, dressed very well, dressed very stylishly, very trendily. I remember him on one occasion. I went for a poetry reading, and Kersy was reading one of his poems on stage, and he was wearing, I remember, I am the sort of interviewee that you dream of. He was wearing a red turtleneck sweater, blue jeans, a pack of Winstons sticking out of the jeans pocket. He had this dark beard and this baritone voice, and he was reading out this poem. And I was thinking to myself, you know, what a fine figure of a man that is. So that was Kersy. He was good looking. He was flamboyant. He had everything that it took. He also had a penchant for red cars. And in those days of ambassadors and Fiats, he had 2 or 3 cars, including a red Mustang, I remember. Christopher de Rosario, the copywriting wunderkind nephew of Frank Simoes, who came up in part under Katrak's guidance and would eventually make a stellar career abroad, explained, he was an amazing writer. Of course, he loved the theater of Kersy. That was all part of it. Like the world's a stage and Kersy is the lead player. I mean, aside from being part of the theater itself, he loved being a dramatic person on the stage of everyday life. An associate of Katrak's from the ashram years concurred, albeit more acerbically. Just saying good morning for him was a Shakespearean production. Of course, these were elementary forms of the client presentation and even of internal agency briefings, the pacing, the gestures, the flourishes, the gaze turned to distant horizons. Katrak drew on his theater training, remembered MCM account executive Dilip Bende, treating the conference room as his stage. He would use that to the hilt. He knew exactly what he was doing. He would recite poetry beautifully. He would recite lines and presentations. He would recite anecdotes and so on. Beautiful, beautiful. Clients were all the time watching him as he was walking from one end to the other. Sometimes he'd play the psych-out game of appearing to de-sell the agency's campaign ideas in a client meeting, appearing to take the client's side against the agency, and then gradually leading them round to closing the deal. Katrak's daughter, Maya, offered the gentlest interpretation. The flash cars, the lavish parties, the crates of champagne, the outsized booming personality, all that, she explained, was a deliberate act. He was actually an extremely shy guy, she said, but he had the ability, and I think he felt it was necessary. He wanted the agency to have that profile. He wanted the aggression. He wanted the slight arrogance. And he was the face, so he projected that. As we know, though, the player's mask has a way of sticking to the face, of becoming the face. Many years later, after Kersy was gone, his wife Usha emphatically thumped the table at which we were sitting as she told me, he was running, before he had even started to walk. People had never seen this kind of thing, and people just wanted to work with him. It was mixed, said Dilip Bendy. He became a legend. People started talking about him, talking about the agency. Talk about Kersy was all over town. Ioan Culianu argues that it is with Giordano Bruno in the 16th century that the magician's work takes on an explicitly public dimension. Bruno, writes Culianu, is the first to exploit the concept of magic to its ultimate conclusions, envisaging this science as an infallible psychological instrument for manipulating the masses as well as the individual human being. Culianu calls this kind of public magician an integral magician, which is to say, a magician in the service of a state, or we might add by extension, in the service of a corporation. Okay, fine. So we can go along with Culianu's comparison between Bruno's magician and present-day publicists. But we do also need to point out that public doesn't mean the same thing today as it did in Bruno's time, and that the language that we have now for understanding the forces with which these integral magicians work is quite different than it was even in the 18th or 19th centuries, let alone the 16th. The 20th century was the great age of mass publics, mass movements, and mass politics. And it gave us a largely psychological vocabulary with which to understand these mass phenomena. Subliminal influences, unconscious motivations, false consciousness, weapons of mass distraction. All these concepts presume that what is at issue is the relation between psychological processes on the one hand and words and images on the other. The dominant trope is of a grand struggle between sophisticated forces of manipulation on the one hand and the heroic pathos of the critical and self-determining individual on the other. Influence, literally, a flowing in, is automatically suspect in this scenario. It is as if we're supposed to imagine a zero-sum relation between influence on one side and agency on the other. Now, part of what motivates me is the sense that the official self-understanding of the global north lost something quite important when it progressively abandoned influence and resonance-based understandings of social life. In the process, social science relinquished to esotericism and ultimately to New Age babble the project of making sense of the shared field of force that someone like Giordano Bruno took for granted. That field of force, at once a substance and a relation, and I quote, which orders, generates, rules, attracts, and inflames all things, and which moves, reveals, illuminates, purifies, pleases, and completes all things, unquote. A web of latent powers and correspondences that made the binding work of the integral magician possible. A web something like that dimension that Ashish called the powers of the middle region. This is what I was talking about near the beginning today when I said that the mainstream mechanisms of our modernity are already magical, but that most of us no longer know how to talk about it, other than as something mysterious, occult, or esoteric. We tend to think of the advertising person as a puppet master standing well back and apart from the phantasms that they're activating. But why should we think that the magician is safe from the powers they raise? Is there not always also the question of how the operator gains and sustains their attunement to these same powers? The bright side version of the scenario goes something like this. The real magician isn't standing back. Rather, they bring all of themselves to the table. Katrak's daughter Maya reflected on her father. I think Kersy's whole deal was, and this is something he said to me repeatedly, that the best advertising people, the people who are the best in any profession, are the guys who bring the whole of themselves to that. So we're not coming into a job every day saying, okay, now I'm thinking advertising, I'm thinking marketing, I'm thinking sales, I'm thinking brand. Rather, I'm bringing everything that I am to the job and to any relationship within that. Katrak himself once wrote that real magic demands the whole man, paunch, weak knees and all. But if real magic demands the whole man, then how does the man protect himself? This seems to me a crucial question. Consider once again Juan Culiano's discussion of Giordano Bruno. Implicated here is the will of the manipulator, writes Culiano, which must be of an altogether special kind. Indeed, Bruno warns every manipulator of phantasms to regulate and control his emotions and his fantasies, lest believing himself to be their master, he nevertheless becomes dominated by them. And then he quotes Bruno, "Be careful not to change yourself from manipulator into the tool of phantasms." Be careful not to change yourself from manipulator into the tool of phantasms. But how? What protection does the magician have? The magician isn't just the external engineer of Eros. In order to know, and thus to be, in order to do, the magician must themselves enter into a resonant relation with the world, must enter into relation with what Ashish called the powers of the middle region. Culiano acknowledges that in this regard, Bruno demands of the manipulator a superhuman task. It's not that Bruno's magicians should be cold. Quite the contrary, they have to feel, and feel intensely, the emotions that they're mobilizing. They have to inhabit the phantasms with which they seek to bind their prey. But they must also, and at the same time, feel and inhabit with detachment. This is how Culiano puts it. Bruno's manipulator is the man who knows all about love in order to learn not to love. An intense sublimation, perhaps. To maintain the strength of the bond, it must not be enjoyed. The magician manipulator must be continent and at the same time ardently desire the subject. One readily assents to Culiano's remark here when he says, "It is a strange and almost unbelievable method." Advertising, like modern theater, fictionalizes its power. Stage actors framed by the proscenium arch can really and profoundly change things in the world by pretending. In the same way, we can call advertising a kind of magic, but all the time we behave as if it's only a metaphor. To say that advertising is magic tends to come with a built-in silent but enormous as if, a fictionalizing distance. Again, a tacit agreement not to take any of it too seriously. Still, the actor may think that they're pretending, but that the actor may think that they're pretending, but the powers they raise are real. And these powers have bite and purchase. We may dismiss these powers as psychological or as an expression of social need, and thereby think we've explained or demystified something, but reality changes all the same. The magic of the as if is not only that it preserves a really efficacious space for magic by calling it fiction, it's also that it allows us to continue to believe that we are free agents, that we are free to choose what to believe in, and that we're capable of drawing a clear line between what is real and what is illusion. But ironically, this is also what lets real magic do its fictional work on us, since we are confident that we can always step out of the circle whenever we want to return to reality. Thus defanged, magic gains its bite and purchase as magic. A version of this magic circle, this as-if circle, is also what is supposed to keep the magicians safe from the powers they mobilize. It's the line that should equip them at all times to observe Giordano Bruno's instruction. Be careful not to change yourself from manipulator into the tool of phantasms. Bruno's universe was, in the Hermetic Neoplatonic style, a realm of latent correspondences that could be activated by the operator who knew how. But the operator was themselves a part of that interconnected resonant cosmos, substantially continuous with it. That was how the operator could activate those powers in the first place. The relation between would-be manipulator and the phantasms with which they might seek to bind others or control the world was in truth always already transitive in both directions. This is the innermost mystery of magical action. At that point, the fictionalizing as if no longer offers any protection. At that point, The meaning of be careful can no longer have anything to do with keeping one's distance. The magical operator is in it, and it is real. At some point in the 70s, Katrak wrote a play, Avadut, loosely based on the Bacchae of Euripides. Katrak's stand-in for Euripides' Dionysus character is the Shaivite mendicant, Avdut Baba, who shows up and causes all manner of mischief in a mountain village not unlike Mirtola, the site of Ashish's ashram. In his opening monologue, Avdut Baba affirms this inescapably transitive quality of the powers that animate him, declaring, I am eater, I am eaten. As in Euripides' tragedy, a central theme of Katrak's play is the terrible price to be paid for thinking that you can hold the line against forces far greater than any earthbound sovereignty. Early memories often initially come back as the memory of a feeling. In this particular case, I remember it as an atmosphere of fascinated unease, bordering on terror. The feeling is attached to Trollkarlen from Indialand, the magician from Indialand, a 1950s children's song by the Swedish writer Lennart Hellsing, to which I used to listen as a young child in 1970s Helsinki. The song tells of an Indian magician capable of turning 8 into 19 and 19 into 2. He can turn river water, 1, 2, 3, into tea and coffee, and a nutshell into a stately frigate. He makes the stars rain down like golden sand and turns the moon into a lemon in his hand. But as ever, pride comes before a fall. The magician can't resist accepting a crafty challenge set by the Emperor of China, who bets that no one, not even the magician from Indialand, can turn themselves into a glass of lemonade. No sooner is the gauntlet thrown down than the magician has succeeded. But the sun shines down hot over rice fields and streams. The magician becomes thirsty and drinks himself up. That magician from Indialand goes on to regret his mistake for 700 years. Remember that story about Kersy Katrak meeting Madhava Ashish for the first time and responding to Ashish's routinely sly, "What are you?" with, "I'm a magician"? After his exile at the ashram during 1980 to 1983, Katrak re-entered the Bombay advertising world, but now, as it were, in quotation marks. He was no longer allowed to own his own agency, but he could be hired as a kind of icon. Kersy Katrak, legend of the creative revolution. It was a difficult time. He'd lost all his money and made many enemies. Katrak seemed at one level to want to lay all the clever hustle of the past to rest. As he put it in a poem from around this time, "O you who eat my harvest, Parsi or Jew, milking the usual cow or looking bankward, remember Katrak, once as crafty as you." But then, how to go on? It's a well-worn literary trope. How do you give up magic? It's the dilemma of King Prospero in Shakespeare's Tempest. The exiled King Prospero, like Katrak, has to renounce his magic in order to be readmitted into society, drowning his book and breaking his staff. Prospero is exiled on an island for 12 years. Katrak took precisely that long, 12 years, to repay his MCM debts, although he was back in Bombay sooner. Giving up magic isn't just about agreeing not to do something anymore. It's also coming to a new and painful settlement with a permanent part of yourself, an inner need that will never fully disappear. One imagines that consciously or not, Katrak already understood at the outset that the bills would come due, and that while the financial debts would be painful, the existential reckoning would be terrible. Katrak's poem, Fragments of a Conjugation, appeared in 1969. It's really quite uncanny because in this poem, Katrak appears to be looking back from the other side of the crisis that was when he wrote it yet to hit him. Here he is, holding a future rage and shame, as if looking back from that future self. After it happened, he hid, reduced his commerce with the world, was careful of the things he did, avoided girls, pretended it was nothing new, obtained another job and found a room with a restricted view, settled down, controlled his rage, refused to give, stopped writing verse, slackened his pace, and found at last a way to live with his own face. And found at last a way to live with his own face. I've often thought over the years that everyone except Kersy Katrak could afford either to romanticize or to scandalize his story. I often think back to him telling me during our meeting in 1998, when I was in MCM, advertising was my life. Now advertising is the way I make money. It's my profession. It's not my life. In fact, I'm bored by advertising now. It's a way of earning my bread and my butter and my jam, but it's nothing else. And I'm good at it because I've been at it long enough. That's all. I emerged despondent from that meeting, feeling only the aspect of disappointment and deflation in Katrak's words. But when I look at them again now, in the light of everything I've learned, I realized that there was also a note of defiance in him that day, a defiance precisely in that attitude of indifference to the cult, the fetish of advertising, a refusal of the correct way to care about the work of advertising. What do I mean by that? Advertising claims, perhaps uniquely, to be a professional practice in which the magician's power, which is of course much wider and more general than advertising, can be economized, rationalized, rendered sensible and methodical. Remember what I was saying earlier about how advertising says that creativity can be reconciled with business? It's a paradoxical and profound claim. It's the claim that something beyond economy can be brought within economy. The ideological fantasy is that one can have the magic and at the same time subordinate it to an ordinary sober ethics of the bottom line. This is a fantasy. Advertising, like all magnetizing work, always activates powers far more complex and ambiguous than any accounting in terms of brand parameters or financial ledgers can contain. It's not just that the sights and sounds of advertising always mean more than they appear to. It's also that they implicate all those of us who harness and relay these powers. This is why, when it comes down to it, the accounts to be settled are in the end never just physical bills, but also psychic ones. This is why, perhaps, the price of a successful career in advertising, as in so many kinds of magnetizing work, shows up in ways that at first sight would appear to be private: depression, addiction, dissociation. That's where we get the return of what the ideological equation of advertising represses, that supposedly neat equation of creativity and business. Creativity itself, here, is a kind of code word for all the complex fascinations and seductions of the powers of the middle region. And I think again of Ashish's sober warning for those who dabble, those who might think it's all just a lark, a bit of good fun. Needless to say, 2 and 2 always do add up to 4 in the long run, the apparent discrepancy being paid for with interest, for such powers exact their price. Katrak was known, you'll recall, as a great inspirer of human beings. That turned out to be a trickier and perhaps costlier talent than it might at first appear. Around the time MCM was falling apart, Katrak wrote a poem to which he gave the title Magicians. When I came across it decades later, it made me blush, or maybe I should say it made me blanch, because the poem is quite directly addressed to a future person who would presume to interpret or judge Katrak. A person Katrak calls my bastard son, my grave psychiatrist. The poem demands that I, its reader, should drop the usual apparatus and armor of my professional poise and confront myself in the same inner spaces that I would presume to confront Katrak. The poem seems to speak from bitter experience. It cautions that I should not make the mistake, having undertaken the work, of thinking that others will understand what I've seen or know what I'm talking about. The truths of the inner realm will at best, be squandered in the marketplace of everyday life. But then again, Katrak's poem seems to be suggesting misrecognition has its compensations. If everyone thinks you're just a cut-price magician who once sold your soul, but are now well past your sell-by date, then you can use that disguise to work some real magic. What Ashish called the powers of the middle region will just look to everyone else like ordinary, humdrum reality. That may in the end be the final alibi, the final as if, the real Faustian pact, the last magic circle. The poem ends with these lines: "And learn, good Dr. Faustus, to walk with caution eternally thereafter. It's not only when flowers appear magically on your palm or the signature of the heavens on your wall. No one will see them, or at the most, remark on exotic tattoo or splendid mural. It's not your speech only that you will guard, but reflex, your way of walking, how you look at people. Remember, if you do not wish to lose even your few remaining friends, keep your disguises, continue to drive your sports car, justify nothing, joke as usual. As for your truth, indulge in the harmless pastime of writing verse. There all is metaphor. All will be taken for the same old lies. Thank you very much.